Carter's words were uncalled for. After all, Melvin was having a normal chat with him, yet he insisted on using this to taunt him. Uncharacteristically, Melvin didn't respond, as if Carter had spoiled his mood and he no longer wished to talk about this. He indifferently looked at the stock trends like the conversation a moment ago had never happened. But seeing his expression, Carter suddenly grew curious. "Hey, let me ask you something." Carter deliberately bumped his knee against Melvin. Melvin turned his head over. "About malicious short selling." Carter paused. "Did you do it?" Carter had never poked his nose into inmates' business. There were too many people who didn't have pure intentions in prison. Everyone could make up stories to embellish themselves. The reason he asked Melvin this, he swore he wasn't trying to be nosy. At most, was that he wanted to offer a little help to Grant. Melvin didn't give a direct answer. Instead, he asked back, "What do you think, Officer James?" Without considering it, Carter blurted out, "I don't know." As soon as the words left his mouth, Carter saw the corners of Melvin's lips quirk up slightly, as if all the gloom from being dissed just now was swept clean. "You don't know," Melvin repeated with a smile, and only then did Carter react in hindsight that his tongue slipped. How could he say that he didn't know? He was a prison officer. Melvin was a convict. Naturally, he should unconditionally believe the judge's verdict and tell Melvin, "I think you did it." That was the normal logic. Yet, he had clearly wavered, implying that there was a part of him that believed in Melvin's innocence. No matter how significant that part actually was, it wasn't zero in any case, or he wouldn't have answered that he didn't know. Carter couldn't help but feel vexed. Melvin was a goddamn logic freak. How else could he react so promptly and pick at his opening so precisely? Melvin's mood visibly became much better. He looked at the computer screen, then changed the subject. "Officer James, you dressed up so nicely today. Are you going into the city to have fun?" Carter tossed back again, "None of your business." Melvin turned his head over, giving Carter a once-over, asking, "Meeting an online friend?" Not bothering to go into detail, Carter perfunctorily said, "Yes." "Is that so?" Melvin nodded thoughtfully. "A male internet friend." Carter couldn't help but find it strange. "How do you know it's a guy?" Melvin's tone was calm, without the faintest billow. "You like men." Carter's had never publicly come out of the closet. In Southside Prison, apart from Luke, no one knew his sexual orientation. He frowned slightly and emphasized, "I don't like men." Carter didn't know what he was hiding, as if somewhere in his subconscious, a voice kept reminding him not to expose himself to Melvin, else he would be treated as prey. And here, Melvin didn't insist on the topic. Looking at the time, he stood up. "Have a good date, Officer James." After work, Carter and Luke drove in separate cars to a restaurant that recently opened in the city. They waited for nearly half an hour in the private room. Just when Carter was about to burst from impatience, a tall man in a suit walked in from outside. "Sorry, something held me up for a while." The man pulled out a chair and sat down, placing his luxury brand car keys to one side. "It's understandable," Luke quickly mediated. "Lawyers tend to have busier schedules." Carter affected a polite smile, pretending that he didn't mind. Luke made introductions for the two parties. The man was called Frank. He was already a distinguished senior associate at a law firm. He and Luke had met each other in a fishing club. As the nature of their work both involved criminals, they were able to hit it off rather well. "I can barely tell that Mr. James works at a prison too." Frank was a good conversationalist and he naturally guided the conversation towards Carter. Although Carter was reluctant to be match-made, he was still a mature adult who knew how to behave according to the social occasion. "Compared to the prison guards, I don't interact with the inmates as much." "Are there times when you'll meet inmates that are harder to keep in line?" Naturally, Melvin's face floated up in Carter's mind. Actually, to be precise, Melvin couldn't be considered difficult to manage. He would cooperate with the prison guards most of the time, only on occasion doing some actions that Carter couldn't tell if they were intentional or unintentional, driving him nuts. "I heard from Dr. Luo that many inmates would make passes at Officer James." Now that I see you in person, I finally understand why. Frank had a way with words. His praise didn't sound forced and he gave off a sincerity that came from his character. Carter had deducted points for his tardiness just now, but after they began chatting, this score gradually recovered. Not long later, Carter abruptly realized that Luke had been to the washroom for a long time. Getting a bad feeling about it, he took out his phone, and as expected saw that there was an unread notification from Luke. Something came up. "You two enjoy your meal." "Dr. Lewis says that he has something on," Carter said, smiling insincerely at his phone. I saw. Frank had checked his phone too. "He should be trying to create opportunities for the two of us, I wager." Carter didn't expect Frank to be this blunt with his words, directly mentioning that the purpose of this meeting was a blind date. At first, he was still thinking of making friends, but after this layer of pretenses was torn off, the score in his mind inevitably turned more sizable. Being a good conversationalist could probably give him 20 points, his looks could probably give him 10. However, being obsessed with work was a definite -30. Carter wasn't someone with much professional ambition, or he wouldn't have taken on an idle job as a librarian in a prison. Every 3 sentences out of Frank's mouth was about work, like his life revolved around his work. He was obviously a textbook workaholic. Compared to workaholics, Carter much preferred someone who knew how to enjoy life, such as someone who would sear steak and take care of their yard in their downtime at home, instead of constantly having work on their mind. "Are you wearing an old timepiece?" Frank's attention landed on Carter's wrist. "You must be a sentimental person." Old Timepiece was the brand name of the antique watch that Carter wore, so rustic that it sounded dirt cheap. Usually people who wore this brand were either sentimental or poor, and the majority belonged to the latter category. Carter glanced at Frank's wrist. The shiny watch on him should be upwards of several 10,000s. "Not especially," Carter said blandly. He belonged to a third category. He was too lazy to buy a new watch. But this wasn't the point. Just like how he was mentally scoring Frank, he could tell that Frank was also sizing him up. The reason it got harder to fall in love with age was that people were no longer willing to take the time to understand what someone was like on the inside, having grown used to judging compatibility based on various external considerations. From the moment that they met, both parties already knew that they had come with unclean motivations and were measuring each other by their own standards. Some people didn't mind such an approach, while others didn't like first meetings to be so utilitarian. At least, in Carter's opinion, a relationship with such a preface could never be a real relationship. "I heard from Dr. Lewis that you live in the suburbs. Do you often come to the city a lot?" Frank continued to ask. Perhaps because the underlying reason for this meeting was openly acknowledged, Carter immediately recognized that Frank was inquiring about his financial situation. Actually, this didn't surprise him. After all, the other was an elite lawyer who earned at least 7 figures a year. It was only logical that they would be picky when choosing a partner. "I don't usually come to the city much," Carter said truthfully. "I prefer the quiet." The city can be quite noisy indeed. As Carter listened to Frank chat about the differences between living in the city and in the suburbs, a flash of light suddenly went off in his head. How did Melvin know that he would need to go into the city when going out to have fun? Quoting his previous words, "Officer James, you dressed up so nicely today. Are you going into the city to have fun?" At least half the prison guards lived in the city. Generally, when these people went out on a casual basis, it would naturally be in the city. There wasn't any need to especially point out that they would be going into the city center. Only people who lived in the suburbs would have another option when going out, into the city. Whereas the way that Melvin phrased the question made it apparent that he had taken Carter not living in the city as a default setting. Was it possible that Melvin knew where he lived? The more Carter thought about it, the more he found it off. But he still had to focus on his conversation with Frank first. "You used to work in an enviable job at the courthouses. What made you decide to transfer jobs to the prison?" Carter really wanted to say that not everyone placed their jobs at the forefront of their minds. Was it that bizarre that he was willing to go to the city outskirts to take life easy? But he knew that this wasn't something that Frank could wrap his mind around, because he had more or less gotten a sense of Frank's background from their short chat. Frank was born into a normal family and had, through hard work, climbed up the social ladder. As such, he placed particular emphasis on things like social status, as evident from the watch he wore and the car keys he placed on the table. "It's easier for me to get to work if I live in the suburbs," Carter said. "So that's it," Frank nodded. While he didn't show any disappointment on his face, since then, his words visibly lessened. When it came to settling the bill, Frank took the initiative to pull out his wallet. As expected, it was another luxury brand item. But Carter scanned the QR code before he did, saying, "Let me." "There's no need for that, Mr. James," Frank stopped Carter. "I should do it." Now, that was a loaded statement. When two people shared a meal, neither owed any favors to the other. By this logic, it was fine for either of them to get the check, and whether or not someone should do it shouldn't be a consideration. Frank's only criterion for judging this was that he believed Carter to be financially strapped. As such, he should be the one to get the check. "Don't worry about it." Carter scanned the QR payment code faster than Frank could pull out his credit card. As he entered the amount on the screen, he said with an indifferent expression, "My family owns many properties in the city center." While it may have been a little abrupt, Carter's meaning was clear. He didn't want to give Frank any grounds to continue on his high horse. Frank didn't continue to make a fuss, silently keeping his branded wallet. Carter wasn't someone who coveted money because his family really wasn't lacking money. Leaving aside his attempt to go cold turkey on his voyeurism, his reason for moving to the suburbs was simple: he wanted to live comfortably. And the reason why he couldn't be bothered to be like the warden, following Melvin to earn money through stocks, was because he didn't even have any desire to make money. In the new week, a familiar face returned to prison. Carter had to sit him through the introductory lesson again, thus didn't get the guards to bring Melvin to the library. Officer James, long time no see. In the meeting room, Gavin, whose head was shaved bald, saluted Carter, blinking owlishly at him, as if without the least bit of awareness that he was now in prison. "Has it been long?" Carter slapped down the slim book, putting on a stern front. "Coming back in again so soon, do you really think that prison is your home?" He. Gavin wasn't at all frightened by Carter's fierce face, whispering secretively, "Officer James, I come here with an important mission this time." "Mission? What a Chunny Bayou way of putting it. Only this stinky brat would say such a thing in the whole of Southside Prison." "What mission?" Carter played along with him, asking. "I asked around already. Melvin is locked up in here, right?" When Melvin's name came out from Gavin's mouth, Carter imperceptibly arched his eyebrows, asking unfazed, "What are you asking around about him for?" This wicked capitalist was clearly fined $300 million but only paid a third of it. "He must have transferred his assets offshore. I'm going to do God's work and dig up all of his hiding holes." Well, put in perspective, Gavin did have a deep-rooted hatred for capitalists. Carter knew a little of his family background. It was through stock trading that his father had lost their family fortune, causing his mother to die of depression. $300 million isn't a small sum. Carter couldn't bear to rain on Gavin's parade, reminding him obliquely instead. Melvin's small house had obviously been seized by the court because he was unable to pay the $300 million fine. But Gavin refused to believe that a capitalist would be broke. He went on heedlessly, analyzing. "He probably still has accounts outside the country. I've to dig them out bit by bit, then hack his accounts." Carter was getting a headache. What was this kid trying to do, exposing the inside details of his criminal plan to a prison officer right after coming in? Did he have no brains? "You'd better behave yourself," Carter said. "Otherwise I'm getting your Dr. Luo to deal with you." Sure enough, at the mention of Luke, Gavin instantly felt the nigglings of guilt. He stammered, "Don't tell him my plan." Carter scoffed. Dream on. This naive child seriously needed to be slapped by reality. During the afternoon break, Gavin furtively snuck into the library. It was obvious that he was hiding from Luke in the opposite infirmary. Carter roughly had an idea of why this kid would come to such a dangerous place as the library, because not long later, Melvin also came here. Carter would only read to Melvin after 2 o'clock, but before that, Melvin would usually come to the library to pass time as a regular inmate. Gavin practically locked onto Melvin's position almost immediately. Though his 2 hands were holding a book, his eyes were secretly following Melvin's figure. As always, Melvin went to sit in the back corner by the windows. Walking there from the door required him to pass by Gavin. The distance between the two of them closed. Carter watched as Gavin quietly stretched out a leg with glaringly obvious intent. He wanted to trip Melvin. Sighing, Carter shook his head. He initially thought that Melvin would just step across Gavin's leg, but little did he expect that that man wouldn't show any mercy, ruthlessly stepping down on Gavin's leg without a moment's pause. "Ow!" a howl echoed in the library. Carter saw Melvin apathetically shoot Gavin a sidelong glance, a single word broadcasting from his eyes: "Idiot." At this time, Luke appeared at the entrance of the library, and as soon as Gavin saw him, he cried out pitifully, "Dr. Luo, my leg hurts." Luke whisked Gavin off to the infirmary, and the library was restored to silence. Carter checked the time. When he lifted his eyes, he looked straight towards Melvin, who had just sat down by the window. Their eyes met. Melvin tilted his head, his expression seeming to say, "What are you looking at me for?" To be frank, Carter was already beside himself with impatience accumulated from holding it in all weekend. Today, he could finally get to the bottom of what Melvin meant by going into the city. Never before had time passed more excruciatingly in the afternoon. Carter was basically glancing at Melvin every few minutes. Melvin was leisurely holding a comic book in his hands, reading it with relish, whereas Carter could barely get himself to do anything at all, not even in the mood to open the surveillance he had on the recreation room. The reason for this was simple. This was already the second time that he hadn't performed well. Just like that time when Melvin used his eyelashes as an excuse to tease him. Melvin could find the openings in his words with alacrity, but it took him a long time, only noticing during dinner that there was something wrong with Melvin's words. The annoyance he felt from this was way higher on the scale than losing an argument. Time slowly trickled to 2 o'clock. The inmates in the library finally began to stream out. However, Melvin appeared to be enraptured by the comic book he was reading. Though there was no one else in the library, he was still steadfastly planted in his seat by the windows. 1017. Ultimately, Carter was still the first to crack. "Are you coming over or not?" Melvin raised his head and looked at Carter, the corners of his lips hooking in a subtle arc. He openly met Carter's gaze. "Officer James, your eyes are very intense when looking at me today. Are you hiding something from me?" Carter didn't give any buffer and directly struck out first, not giving Melvin any chance to ready himself. This question obviously carried the intent to unearth answers, but in any case, Carter wasn't expecting Melvin to honestly own up to anything. He merely wanted to judge his reaction to it. But little did he expect that Melvin would fall silent for a moment and deal him a curveball. "Yes." "What?" Carter unconsciously frowned, his nerves pulling tight. Melvin slowly opened his mouth, as if deliberately keeping him in suspense, waiting for a good while before finally saying, "I think you look very attractive in your uniform." "Just that?" Carter froze for a split second, then swiftly cottoned on to that Melvin was teasing him. He suppressed the ire that rose in his heart, asking sternly, "Melvin, do I look easy to bully?" "Nope." Melvin's attitude was sincere as he said, "I've seen how fierce you look when beating someone with a baton. How can I dare?" But compared to the prowess Melvin showed when beating someone up, Carter practically paled into obscurity. He couldn't put a finger to it, but he kept feeling that Melvin was repeatedly skipping back and forth across the line of bullying him. "Say, Officer James," Melvin naturally changed the subject, "how did your date go?" "It was okay," Carter casually replied, then immediately brought the subject back. "When you asked me before whether I was going into the city, how did you know that I don't live in the city?" "Did I?" Melvin asked without a flicker in this expression. Carter never expected that Melvin would actually flat out deny it. He could only blame himself for not catching it on the spot, else Melvin wouldn't even have the opportunity to play dumb. You did. Carter glared at Melvin, saying, "You asked me if I was going into the city to have fun." "Oh, you mean that?" Melvin skillfully countered. "After you get off work, wouldn't that be going into the city?" There was certainly a difference between going into and going back to the city. But if they really were to pick at the logic in it, they would go around in a circuitous argument. And here, Carter finally spotted a problem. No matter what he said, Melvin could just say that he was overthinking it. This was unlike his obvious slip-up when he said that he didn't know. The feeling that Melvin gave him was that he was purposefully exposing his tail, only for him to look and not to touch. It was infuriating. "Do you know where I live, or not?" Seeing that he was unable to unearth anything at all, Carter couldn't resist asking the question that he had stewed over the entire weekend. "Where do you live?" Melvin asked curiously. "Is it near me?" Carter was teetering on the verge of an explosion, almost giving up the game. "Yeah, I live right across the street from you. When I've nothing better to do, I'd spy on you." But, for better or for worse, his rationality pulled him back from charging off the cliff, letting him swiftly regain his normal composure. "Not at all," Carter coldly said. "I live in the city." Since he couldn't get anything, then there was no point in asking. He couldn't be sure whether or not Melvin was playing dumb. If he was, then he'd play right along with him. "Is that so?" Melvin touched his chin, affecting a perplexed expression. "Officer James, how do you know that the city is far from where I stay? In other words, how do you know where my house is?" Carter gave a start. When his brain finally rounded the bend, he instantly felt like he was struck by lightning. He'd actually slipped up again. He said that they didn't live near each other, but the question was, it was only by knowing where Melvin stayed that he could determine the distance between their residences.